Session Blood.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Session Blood episode 14. And we're actually back to recording in person, which is a bit fun.
Yeah, I mean, here in New Zealand we have level 1 lockdown coming down, so we'll be able to actually record in person, which is always nice.
Yeah, it's great. And so for today's episode, we are going to switch things up a little bit, and we want to talk about some general topics. So, Carol, I know you definitely wanted to put a bit of a focus on pitching and sort of advanced methods of pitching.
Yeah, it's just some ideas too that we can throw around to help good players become great players. If you kind of feel there's areas of the game that you can improve on, I feel like pitching is something that has a massive depth of strategy, so it's definitely something I want to talk about.
Yeah, and that's something I feel that I could improve in my game as well, so I'll be listening closely to you for sure. And I think after that I'll be just having a look at sideboarding. I suppose it's not strictly the correct term in Flesh and Blood, but as a throwback to Magic, I always call it that. So basically what your thought process should be behind taking cards in or taking cards out for certain matchups along those lines. But before we get into that, as always, we love our shout-outs, so we might just start off with a couple. Did you want to go first, Carol?
Yeah, so I just want to give a massive shout-out to Zafran Chai, who is a Malaysian player that I've been in touch for a while now. He sent me, we had some trades going, and it all went nice. It's nice to see very kind of like that Flesh and Blood community spirit, transcending countries. So massive shout out to him for helping me out with the trades. And I also have a shout out to Cale McCree, who is the most experienced player in Flesh and Blood.
Literally.
I mean, like literally, if you look at the leader boards, he is number one in terms of all-time player experience and last 90-day experience. I don't know how he manages. I don't know. He must be playing those anywhere games. What is it called? The
play anywhere.
Play anywhere in his sleep or something. But yeah, massive shout out to him, because this is a player that I've kind of, when we both, I guess, started Flesh and Blood, he was the player to beat. And I've learned a lot through versing him. And I'll be using some of the examples from our games in this podcast, actually. Do you have some shout-outs?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So, yeah, Cal's a great guy. I think some of my earliest Flesh and Blood memories have come from playing at tournaments with Cal. Shout out, road to the calling Palmerston North back in the day.
Yeah.
Fun guy to be around, and always willing to help out new players, and just a great community presence. So, cheers, Cal. I just had a couple of quick shout-outs today. My first one was going to be to the latest winner of the Malaysian Road to Nationals, Rain Amran, I believe, who took it out on a Mechanologist deck. So I'm looking forward to looking at the deck list for that when it comes out, probably sometime this week. A big congratulations to you. Secondly, I wanted to give a shout-out to the international community, because I saw recently that distribution deal was just locked in for Europe. I know we've got some really good communities in places like the Netherlands, England, and Poland even as well.
Yeah.
Seen some great posts on the fan page about that. So, and of course,
dziękuję wszystkim graczom z Polski.
Exactly. and of course in America, Taiwan, Malaysia, Flesh and Blood seems to be growing and growing. So I really look forward to seeing the international meta develop. It's going to be great.
Yeah, great news for the European fans. We've definitely had a lot of chats with European players who have been quizzing us, when do we get product? Well, you're finally getting some.
Yeah, and finally a big shout out to Carol's new baby daughter, Nashe. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very exciting times. All right, so we won't go all mushy on you. Let's just dive straight into it. Actually, just before we begin, we just wanted to do a very quick rundown on the Malaysian Road to Nationals. We don't really have the deck list, but we just thought it was sort of interesting to note that the meta, the top 8 at least, reflected pretty closely to New Zealand Nationals.
Yeah, very similar classes in that top 8, definitely.
Yeah, I believe there were sort of 3 warrior players, a ninja, 1 brute, a couple of mechanologists, and I can't quite remember the last one.
Yeah, maybe was it a Guardian? Was it?
Possibly, I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure, unfortunately. But and we saw mechanologist take that one out, beating Brute in the final, which goes to show, that's not quite as easy a matchup as some Brute players will have you believe.
Yeah, I feel like, Arc Smash is a great card, but it doesn't give you that auto win versus Myconologist that a lot of players thought it would. So, yeah, I mean, congrats on the win.
Yeah, congrats, and like I said, look forward to seeing the deck list. All right, anyway, so we'll just dive straight into it. So pitching. So when you think of pitching, it's one of those things in Flesh and Blood where, it's equivalent to almost the old. It's the resource system. It's like mana for a Magic the Gathering, for example.
Hmm.
And a lot of the time, players, including me, quite often even to this day, there's not really too much thought put into it aside from, I two need to pay 3 resources to play a card, so I'll pitch a blue card and that's it.
Hmm.
So what are some of the things you want to go over for advanced pitching to people who might not quite be aware of what you're talking about with that concept?
Yeah, so I mean, in Flesh and Blood, pitching is crucial, and I feel like one of the first stages of pitching is, after you kind of spend block like use cards to block, you kind of have that in the back of your mind. What am I going to pitch to cast? To make my turn kind of optimal. But I feel like in a lot of matchups, and especially this goes to these kind of defensive style plays, maybe even the fatigue type plays. From the very first turn, I feel like pitching is important because if you are in a defensive, if you are versing, a defensive deck versus a defensive deck, you're most likely going to go to that late game stage where you start drawing the cards that you pitched. Um, this might not be as important for aggro versus aggro, but I think pitching is still important for those matchups as well. So first of all, I think when pitching is you have to be aware of the threats that you are pitching and that your opponent's pitching. And a lot of these new decks, I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on setting up big plays at the end of the game. We've seen that with great brute lists from Jason and Isaac. Jason Long and Isaac Olson, who both ran a very really cool brute list that focused on claws, and they used Blood Rush Bellows and Art of Wars. And from some of the games, if you go on the Fab TCG Instagram, there's a great picture where Jason managed to play an Art of War followed by, I think it was a Savage Feast into, or like triple Blood Rush Bellow into a Savage Feast into 2 claws, and was able to deal 36 damage in 1 turn. And I think because he was versing a dash control deck, so I think in that matchup he had a lot of time to basically pitch the cards that he needed to set up that big play, setting up the Bellow, another 6 attack Bellow throughout the game to then just pull off like an amazing turn at the very end there. And that is where I wanted to kind of tell a little story where I versed Kale. That's where I learned a big lesson on pitching when I was playing Guardian versus Kale, who was playing Guardian as well. I was playing more of an aggressive list, and he was playing more of a control list. But that's where I learned a massive lesson about that, that late game stage where your early pitches really matter. So what happened was I was just going basically ham at Kale. I was, hitting him with a hammer, hitting him with cripplings, and he was just defending, and attacking me back with a hammer, which it seemed like I was ahead that game.
You're kind of sitting there going, "What's this guy up to? Best Guardian play, just hitting with hammer."
Yeah. So what happened was I had probably like a 20 life lead. I think I was on like 25 life. I think I was on like 30 life because I would just block his hammer and then swing back harder. And then over the course of the game, what I didn't realize was he was constantly pitching us crippling crushes, using the hammer swings, which, in the game it seemed like a very ineffective play because he would just, basically create a seismic surge and attack with hammer. But what I didn't realize what he was doing is he was setting up a triple crippling, a back-to-back-to-back crippling crush turn. So I was aware that he was saving his crippling crushes. So I was paying enough attention to his pitches where I could see that he was, saving those crippling crushes. But what I missed was that he was doing it in a way that would allow him to cast a crippling back to back to back. So I was happy with, I pitched one unmovable, and I'm like, that unmovable will counter his crippling crush. But what happened is at the very end of the game, when I was kind of pushing through for lethal, there was a turn where, I swung with a hammer. He blocked with, I think it was his equipment, and, took a bunch of damage, went down to 3 life or something like that. And then on his turn went, triple pitch, crippling crush with a card, and so he from Arsenal with a card left in hand. And I was like, okay, I'll just unmovable that and I'll block it. Swing back again. He blocked with the rest of his equipment, and then did the same thing, another crippling crush. And I'm just like, okay, this is getting scary. So I was in a position where, that crippling, the second crippling crush hit. I lost 2 cards of my hand. I wasn't able to do much on my turn, try to block some damage. And then he went for another one right after that, and the same thing happened. So he managed to do a massive chunk of damage and really swing back the momentum from, very persistently and setting up that back-to-back-to-back turn, that's where I learned a lot about, how much pitching means in that very late stage of the game. So yeah, he ended up just winning that game, and that was actually road to calling. So that was a semi-final game.
Okay.
And yeah, he then versed you in the finals.
Yeah, because that's the thing when you're pitching correctly, you can sort of set up those late game turns like Carol illustrated there with the crippling crushes, or perhaps I don't know the circumstances of Jason's game, but like how perhaps he set up the Blood Rush Bellow out of war turn. It makes for turns where if your opponent hasn't been paying attention, or to an outside observer, it looks like, wow, that player just got really lucky with those top decks 2 or 3 turns in a row. But they've actually been spending the entire game paying attention to what they're doing. And it's a similar thing. You can do it. I mean, Wizard, I suppose, is a popular one that people realize you really have to pay attention for Kano's ability, for what you're pitching in your deck order. But it's a similar thing there. You can sort of somewhat innocuously really be pitching these red cards and, pitch a few blues here and there, block, 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 block. And then towards the end of the game, you throw out a sort of 25 damage combo, guaranteed you're knowing it's going through.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say your story about playing Cat reminded me of actually playing against Sasha one time in the calling final, actually, when it was a bit of a similar thing to your game. I was playing Ninja Aggro versus Ninja Control, and it felt like during the game that I had a pretty decent lead. Like, I was ahead on life. I felt like I had all the tempo in the world. I was just constantly sort of crashing through his entire hand, getting damage through here and there. And then about sort of halfway through the game, or just after that, it slowly began to dawn on me that I was going to run out of cards.
Yeah.
So I'd gone through, I was going through all my good red line sort of combo cards, all my great generics. And I was speaking to Sasha after that game, and what he told me kind of stuck with me. He said, I was trading all my bad cards for your good cards. So he was using cards like Flick Flack, which gives you +2 on your next card with combo that you block with each turn. So he'd drop sort of a yellow or a blue Flick Flack on my first attack, and then block my next big attack with, say, like a blue Rising Knee Thrust, for example. So throughout the game, his deck sort of threat density was fine because he was playing a particular game plan, whereas he knew at a certain point that I'd run out of ways to get enough go damage to win the game.
Yeah.
And that game kind of stuck with me as a learning experience going forward about, how you can fall into a bit of a false sense of security with games sometimes if you're not paying attention to pitching.
Yeah, and it might seem inefficient, throughout a game to pitch cards like, if you have a Scar for a Scar, but you're in a higher life, when you pitch a Scar and do something else, it might seem to your opponent like an inefficient play. but what you're actually doing is saving that scar for later. So that is one aspect in where pitching can be crucial for these kind of late games that go late. But another example I want to give is whenever I verse Warrior. Warrior in particular is because you want to be aware of the reprise cards that they have. So a great example for me is when you see a Warrior player pitch a red Iron Song response, or pitch, is it like a red Out for Blood, or maybe sometimes even a Glint, if you can be, if you kind of have the capacity, mental capacity to remember these things, because I've often found myself in a situation where I'm versing a Warrior. I remember that they pitched one or maybe two Iron Song responses, and they maybe blocked with one or used one previously. So I can constantly check the graveyard, see if they thread an Iron Song response, and I know that there's two in the grave, and I remember one being pitched. Sometimes these can be game-winning decisions where you're confident with your block, knowing that they won't be able to kind of blow you out with these cards.
Yeah, and I feel it's particularly important sometimes in kind of the mid to late game as well.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's decks that will utilize shuffle effects. So in Warrior, I'm thinking of cards like Singing Steelblade, for example.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's like you have to just remember that stops being relevant as soon as they shuffle their library.
Yeah, so some decks you can be pretty confident that they're almost never going to shuffle. Like a deck like Brute, for example, I think outside of Sand Sketch Plans and Remembrance, I'm pretty sure there's no shuffle effects in the entire deck. So if you once they've gone through a few cards, if they block with one or two Sand Sketch Plans, or they pitch one, there's very few left, then you can start really paying attention to critical cards like Reckless Swing, for example, because it might be the make or break difference towards the end of the game. If you're forced to go down to, say, 2 life against a Brute player, and you're thinking, do I wait till I draw my life gain cards, or do I try and somehow just grind them out, or do I continue on with the tempo? If you know where those critical cards are in the deck, that just gives you a sense of safety that you can keep going.
Yeah, and another, for me particularly when I verse a class like Warrior, or even when you're versing Wizard, like paying attention to the Surging Strikes, the Gust Waves, but I guess Ninja shuffles the library quite a bit, but it's still good to be aware of the threats and roughly where they are in your opponent's deck. It's not easy. It's pretty tricky, and sometimes it does take a bit of mental strain where if you didn't bother, that wouldn't be there, but it can win games. Like sometimes I verse a Warrior, and I try to keep aware of if they, for example, blocked with a Determination, 1 or 2, and they have 1 or 2 left, and they've pitched them early. I try to keep track where exactly in the library it is, so that I know where it's safe to not arsenal a defense react and go more aggressive.
Yeah,
for example. Sure. Another little pitching thing is I used to have this back in Arcane Rising metagame. I used to have this play, and this is especially important for Brute, where a lot of your cards discard your other cards, so you can't really afford to keep your pitch card in your hand. What I like to do, for example, is have a pummel in my arsenal and go for an Alpha Rampage play. But to pitch for the Alpha Rampage, I'd pitch a yellow first and then pitch a blue. So that would leave me with 2 resources open. So in fact, I'm actually pitching 5 because of the way that pitching works in Flesh and Blood, which allow me to just have no hand, but at the same time have those 2 resources to pummel from Arsenal. And it's not an easy feat to pummel an Alpha Rampage, but it won me so many games because, when you get to that super late stage of the game, people just won't see it coming.
Yeah, and just to go over what you mentioned there, perhaps maybe for some of the newer players or even the experienced ones. So in Flesh and Blood, you have to, if you're pitching a card, technically you play the card first, then pay for the pitch cost. So what this means is that you can't sort of over-pitch for no reason, or unless you do it in the correct order. So say, for example, I'm playing like Warrior. Like if I pitch a blue to play Warrior's Valor, and then attack with my weapon. So that's 2 resources. I've got 1 resource open. If I've got a card like Out for Blood, a 1-cost attack reaction in hand, I have to use that resource that I've got remaining from that original pitch. So I can't then pitch an additional blue card to go up to 4 resources.
Mm-hmm.
So what Carol was mentioning is there is a bit of a workaround with that sometimes if you need to structure the way you're pitching your hand. So like you mentioned, if you have a 3-cost card, you can technically pitch the yellow card first. So you have 2 resources and then the blue card on top of that. Mm-hmm. But just make sure that you're careful in the way you sequence that, because if you're playing at a high-level tournament and you sort of pitch the blue card first and then the yellow card, then your opponent's sort of within their rights to say that you can't actually do that because you're pitching a yellow card for nothing.
Yeah.
So that is a cool little trick to keep in mind. I'm just trying to think. It's like the example Carol mentioned is a really good one. Sometimes there's examples where you just want to structure your hand better for the next turn. So if you've got a red card and a blue card and one other card in hand that's a 2-cost, you might want to pitch the red and the blue, play your 2-cost action, and then you can potentially, say, threaten a pummel, or you can just get rid of that extra card that you don't want to be forced to block with the next turn.
And that's something that I've seen you do quite well in Ninja. Kieran would have this kind of play style where he would have like a 5-card hand, he just took a bunch of damage, and then he pitches like a red surging strike to play a red leg tap, and that just screams to me like he's pitching a red, so his hand must be pretty average, and then it kind of like lulls you into this false sense of security, being like, okay, so you're pitching a red first. And so I'm like, okay, I'll just, let that leg tap through. And then he's like, just starts, pitches a blue, it like goes Kadachi after Katsu and does all this crazy stuff, which, sometimes it's good to play these little mind games with your opponent. And that's definitely worked against me a few times.
Yeah, Ninja's another good example of really paying attention to your pitch as well, because I've been caught out before if you... Say you pitch a yellow card, for example, Hurricane Technique, to play a league tap. Mm-hmm. Now, if they block the league tap and you're thinking, okay, well, then I'll just go Kadachi and then something else. Mm-hmm. You have to be aware of the fact that even if you have a 0-cost blue in your hands, you can't attack with a Kadachi after that league tap because you have 1 resource left. Well, you can attack with a Kadachi, but it won't have go again. So you've got 1 resource left. You've got a card in your pitch zone that costs 1. So you can find yourself in a bit of a trap sometimes. Mm-hmm. So just really good to try structure out your turn with pitching first. And another thing you mentioned about sort of hiding your resources, your available resources in a way, and not sort of misrepresenting your resources, but if, for example, if you're going to be pitching, you're going to need 5 resources for your turn, and you're going to be pitching a yellow card and then a blue card, then I often find, pitch the yellow card first. Because if you pitch the blue card first and play sort of a 2-cost action, they know you've got 1 resource up and they're thinking, there's a whole lot of things they can play. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you pitch your yellow card first to play something, then your last pitch card in hand, at best it's a blue and then they've got 3 resources. Mm-hmm. So that's, maybe kind of a minor thing, but I think in Flesh and Blood games, which are decided by the thinnest of margins, sometimes even planting the smallest seed of doubt into your opponent's mind can really help you out. Yeah,
so just to kind of like summarize pitching, I feel like it's basically just try and be aware of the threats that you pitch for later on in the game, and try to be aware of the threats your opponent pitches, both because you'll see those cards super late in the game. Like, for example, I love to keep track, if my opponent pitches like a Command and Conquer early, or, like Steelblade Supremacy, or Iron Song Determination, or Crippling Crush, some of these like really powerful cards, I try to be aware of that. And I feel like that's when these early game games of Flesh and Blood might seem quite quite easy. You attack with your weapon, they attack back, but there's a lot that goes on with kind of stacking your deck for later on in the game.
Yeah, things in the background, small things that can sort of really add up over the course of a game.
And kind of related to that are cards like that I wanted to cover talking about Enlighten, Strike, and Sink below.
Yep.
Both of them have the ability to put a card from hand on the bottom of your deck without having to be revealed, which is kind of, for me, that is an ability that is sometimes underutilized, And then Enlighten Strike is a great card because, you can whack someone for 7 using one, even a red card, which is great. But the ability to hide a card from your opponent is massive in these high-level plays. You had a situation recently, right?
I did actually, yeah, because cards like Enlightened Strike and Sink Below as well, which you mentioned, I think Sink Below, the card filtering effect is often looked at as the strength of the card, that you can get rid of a card and draw one. But like Carol mentioned, like hiding a card on the bottom can just be really critical in certain games. Particularly, I find when you're hiding impactful cards that might be a 1 or 2 of on the deck that people might not be expecting. So in one of my games at New Zealand Nationals, I was playing Brute vs Warrior. So I was playing against a great Warrior player, Jason Thompson. Shout out to you. Now, the interesting thing I found out after the tournament about his deck list is that he had 1 red Sigil of Solace. So that's an instant card that gains 3 life. Now, against Brute, why that card is particularly strong is because Warrior vs Brutes, at least the version I was playing, the games often are very close and it can go quite late game. And a large part of my game plan is just getting through damage on a few big turns and then sitting back and winning with Reckless Swing with the 2 damage from that. Now, the thing with Reckless Swing, when it gets to late game, you might not necessarily have Reckless Swing and a handful of 6-power cards. So it can be quite tempting, if I've got, say, 2 6-power cards and a Sanch gets planned and a Reckless Swing, I might block with 2 cards and then Reckless Swing for the win for lethal if my opponent's on 2 life. Now, in Jason's case, it didn't actually come up in our game, but like I say, I saw later, I didn't see a Sigil of Solace the entire game, and had it come down to that, and I tried to just go for the win with the Reckless Swing and his Sigil of Solace, that would have been a game-winning play. And the way he did that is, the reason I didn't see it the entire game is because he repeatedly hit it with Enlightened Strike and Sink Below. And so that's something where, like, if you pitch the Sigil even to save for later on, then I'm aware of it and I'm going to be keeping track of it. But the good players, I think, they take those small advantages with the full knowledge of how impactful it can be. And I thought that was a really cool one up on the deck. I think you can do it with things like Pummel as well. And yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, and I remember you playing Runeblade actually, and you were kind of doing a similar thing with Slog, the regurgitating Slog.
Yeah, because we had a Runeblade deck actually that ran some tech. This was before Crucible of War when we were having problems closing out the game on Runeblade.
Yeah, because you always get into this stage with Runeblade where you almost have them, and it gets to that stage where your opponent's on like 1 or 2 or 3 life, and like you're just starting to run out of all your threats, and you just can't push the damage through with Rune Chance.
Yeah, so we had this strategy. I think it might have been Tom Penny who came up with it, or maybe we were testing it. He likes to claim credit for it anyway. We'll give that one to him.
I think I came up with it.
Yeah,
we'll give him credit.
So the idea in our deck is we ran, I think, 3 blue Slogisms and 1 red regurgitating Slog. So the idea was you'd sort of block with these Slogs without the game if you need to, and then ideally you'd try hide the regurgitating Slog. So, we do our best to hide it with like Enlightened Strike or with Sink Below, anything like that. Sometimes you get away with pitching it and they wouldn't notice, but usually then they are aware of the card. So if you do manage to hide it in super late game situations against Runeblade, they look at your graveyard, they see 3 Ascendancies are gone. They're comfortable blocking up with all their equipment and going all in without an Arsenal card. And then just stealing a game by casting a regurgitating Slog, which you can...
Yeah, maybe even with like a Pummel or a Slogism or
something.
So
regurgitating Slog allows you to banish a Slogism from your graveyard to give it Dominate. So it was a cool little side strat we had.
It was surprising by how many games actually that Slog won.
Yeah, it definitely won me a few games.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the thing about pitching. And I suppose just one final thing I was going to say, thinking of one-offs when I mentioned things like Pummel and Sigil of Solace. Pitching is actually quite a powerful way to bluff your opponent as well. Like sometimes you can be intentionally giving them information in order to, again, sort of put doubt in their mind. So at Nationals I was playing Brute, for example, with 1 yellow pummel.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes like that would be a card that I'd hold on to because I wanted to save, but also
You want to pitch it and show that you are running pummels.
exactly, it's cards like Lunging Press as well, perhaps in decks like Guardian. Once you pitch your Lunging Press, it kind of puts the fear into them for the rest of the game that
am I going to get blown out to a Crypt Link?
Yeah, am I going to get blown out by a Lunging Press? Am I going to get blown out by a Command and Conquer pummel? So just an extra little way to sometimes reveal information for your own purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would do that sometimes where I'd have nothing in hand. I would pitch a red card and then a blue card and then play a Command and Conquer, holding a card like a defense reaction in hand or like a sigil in hand, just so I kind of representing those two resources, like hoping that my opponent overblocks. And a lot of time, and I feel like if you're versing a player when there's a lot on the stake, if you're on those kind of top rounds of
like
Swiss, like for nationals and stuff, people tend to play very conservatively. So a lot of the time, people would just overblock.
Yeah, because like sometimes people, even really really good players can get into the zone. Like, do I want to put my entire tournament life on the line?
Yeah. if they have that pummel, I am screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. But that's the kind of I hope that kind of like illuminates a little bit about kind of the depth of pitching, and you can go as deep with this as you want. Like I think, in a few years' time, we'll definitely have these players who are just like remembering every single thing.
People will be looking
every single pitch and just kind of calculating, crazy amounts to see what's left in your deck. But
people are going to look back and say advanced pitching, this is basic.
Yeah, but I really love that. That's something that really kind of drew me into the game because of the ability to set up big plays later on with pitching, and I found it to be a really cool way to tackle like resource management in a card game.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a good way to improve your gameplay. And if you're sort of a new player trying to learn the game, it's a really good thing to try learn right from the start, because it's something I didn't pay attention to early on, because I played Aggro Ninja, which way back in the day, it didn't really affect it as much because you shuffle your deck so often and you're just trying to kill the opponent super quick. But it's something that now, to this day where I try to pay more attention to it, but I have to make a really conscious effort to do it. It's not sort of automatic or background. Whereas I feel like you're pretty good at it. I feel like the top players like Kale McCreath, like Matt Rogers, international champion, to them it's just automatic. So
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, talking about sinks and light and strikes, I was gonna have a quick little story about a game, the first Road to Nationals, where Jacob Pearson won. I've noticed that he did it extremely well, where he was playing dash control with sink belows and enlightened strikes, but he did that extremely well, where he was using his sink belows to hide the enlightened strikes.
Okay.
there was a point in the game where I felt very confident and I felt ahead, but it got into a situation where it was like kind of one life versus one life kind of thing. But that's when he started just going pistol and light and strike for 7, and just started blowing me out with that, and I eventually lost because I did not pay attention. I was like, didn't even occur to me that I didn't see any of his enlightened strikes throughout the game, and then all of a sudden at the very end of the game they started showing up.
Yeah, you can start to think someone's like sided them out against you, and then here they come.
Yeah.
But speaking of siding things out,
nice little segue there.
Thank you. I was like, how do I work this in? The other topic we like that fun here, right? The other topic we just wanted to have a look at today, and again something that you can go incredibly deep on, is the concept of sideboarding in Flesh and Blood. Now, I really, really like the way that the company, or the way the game is designed to allow for this. Now, like we mentioned in previous podcasts, sideboarding, I think the very start of your sideboarding strategy comes when you're building your deck, because you really have to be thinking constantly of what cards do I want to play in what matchups. are there certain matchups where there are cards I absolutely cannot play?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, do I have enough cards to take out, basically?
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is, particularly with the introduction of Crucible of War, one theme that we pushed a lot in these podcasts is that decks are going to run a little bit heavier on equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And that is been sort of partially true.
Mm-hmm.
I feel.
And some lists we have seen these kind of like 10 plus equipment lists, and sometimes we see like only 5 equipment.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting split because I feel in certain decks it sometimes depends about how much respect you give Wizard. Do you dedicate sort of null rune slots, Arcane
Mm-hmm.
Barrier to that? But the thing is, when you're building your deck, sometimes it can be tempting, and I often fall victim to this, of just wanting to put in all these different equipments for basically every situation. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I want to have the Iron Rock gloves in, I want to have my null rune gloves and Brute Gambler's gloves. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I want to have basically 6, 7, 8 equipments so I can have the perfect setup for every single matchup.
Mm-hmm.
And again in Brute as well, if you're wanting to play a version with Mandible Claws, that's another
Mm-hmm.
2 slots.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think it's important to recognise there is an opportunity cost to playing these equipments, and that it makes your deck less flexible for a wider metagame.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that sounds a little bit weird, like how can something that starts the game and play make my deck less flexible? It makes it like better against these decks. But I think you sometimes can risk sort of having an efficient core game plan by overloading your deck with equipments.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing I noticed at the winning deck at New Zealand Nationals, Matt Rogers, I believe he only had 4 equipment in the entire deck. So he just had his 4 core slots and his Teklo pistol, so I suppose 5 in total. And the rest was just cards.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that really gave him the flexibility to play like a different...
5 unmovables, for example, versus Guardian and Warrior.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you can put something like 5 unmovables into your deck, have those for matchups like Warrior and Guardian, and then realize, well, matchups where they're not very good at all, like, you know, Wizard or Brute or Ninja, I can just comfortably take those out and just trim cards here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one thing is, yes, the start of sideboarding comes when you build your deck. But going to some more general concepts, I think as far as tournaments go, however you end up deciding to sideboard, it's
Mm-hmm.
very good to settle on your strategy beforehand and write it down on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have mentioned this before, but again, when you have 5 minutes to sideboard and shuffle up your deck, you don't want to be spending sort of 3.5 minutes of those thinking like
deciding what to put, what to take out.
Yeah, like, do I put this in? Do I take this out? And just like on top of everything, you're going to have to like rush shuffle your deck. Plus, it doesn't start you off in the game on the right note. You're thinking, you're kind of second guessing yourself. Did I do this? Did I do that? And you're...
And yeah, it's that already is kind of like draining your mental capacity.
Exactly.
Yeah, I personally, I love just having, I have this like the night before the tournament or even the week before, depending how soon it is, I kind of just write down the whole sideboard plan for every single matchup, whether it's Ninja Control, Ninja Aggro. I just have this kind of massive piece of paper with everything written out, just so when I sit down, to play, I don't have to think at all. I just look at my piece of paper, just take out the cards that it says on the piece of paper, like just keep it simple. Like,
yeah, so some of the basics of sideboarding is, first of all, I think a critical thing is you don't need to be playing 60 cards. In fact, I think it's very rare these days that you do play the minimum 60 card deck in a lot of matchups.
I feel like, if you're playing a very aggressive deck or a setup deck, you might do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's kind of more common to go for that kind of like 65, 70.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily wrong to play 60 cards. Like if you're playing, for example, an aggressive mechanologist deck and you want to get to your induction chambers and items as quickly as possible, you might just play 60 cards. But the reason I say that is because I know sort of a lot of Flesh and Blood players, not all, but a decent percentage might have played games like Magic the Gathering in the past, where the 60 card minimum was sort of the golden standard. Like you always played 60. Like it was basically always, like, unless you had a very good reason not to. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, it's a lot more flexible. So I think your approach to sideboarding shouldn't be like, how do I get the best 60 card deck in every single matchup? The approach should be, what cards are going to hurt me if I play them in these matchups.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that might be very simple. Like it might be that I'm going to leave cards like Unmovable in against Warrior and against Guardian. Guardian has really big attacks. Unmovable can buy me time to shut down those big turns and really swing the tempo in my favor. Against decks like Ninja and with powerful on-hit effects, and even Warrior, for example, and Brute, you might want to bring in cards zero-cost defense reactions, so things like Sink Below, Fate Foreseen, Springboard Somersault, cards that for reasons particular to those decks, they're very good. So against Brute, for example, they have cards like Barraging Beatdown that punish you for not blocking with 2 or more cards. You don't want to be in a situation there where they intimidate 3 cards and then get this really powerful effect on you. So sometimes having cards like Sink Below can bail you out of a really difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to decks like Ninja, where they've got powerful on-hit effects like Mask of Momentum or the Katsu ability, Whelming Gust Wave, all those sorts of things. Having those defense reactions really lets you, means you don't have to play scared. So if they attack for 5, you can block for 5. If they attack for 3, you can block for 3. And thinking, worst case scenario, I've got the defense reaction as a backup.
Yeah.
This might shut down their whole turn. I'm good to go. So I would say that that's kind of the basics of sideboarding. That there's certain cards that are really good in certain matchups, but sometimes it might be a little bit more subtle than that. So there might be, for example, if you're playing cards like Tome of Findale, or you're playing a lot of other cards that block for 2 damage. When you're playing against a deck, again, with on-hit effects, things that you really have to block, you probably don't always want to have all of those in your deck, because it can lead to situations where you've got 2 cards in hand, they attack for 6, and you can only block for 5. And there's kind of a temptation to be like, well, it's not going to come up. I've got plenty of block for 3 cards in my deck, but
that makes a massive difference.
Yeah, but it
as a Brute player, I just love that most of my stuff blocks for 3. I have been tempted in the past to kind of, play some 2 block cards, but it's just not the same.
Yeah. Now, another thing is that the way you build your deck with the 80 cards is going to be very sort of metagame dependent. So if you're playing at sort of local armories and that there's a similar sort of style of decks that come out every week, then you can sort of really tool your deck in that direction.
There's no wizard, don't play Nauru.
Exactly. So if you're not expecting any wizard players, then you shouldn't be using 2 or 3 slots of equipment to get your Arcane Barrier, or having 2 Irene's Prayer in there, things like that. But again, conversely, if your meta has OTK Runeblade or Wizard, then it's probably worth putting a couple of slots in for things like Irena's Prayer and obviously Null Rune. But it's things like that. There might be cards that seem like really good sideboard cards, but if they're not relevant in the particular metagame, then there's no point running them. If you're dedicating sort of 2 or 3 slots to a deck that you might play once, then you kind of really have to assess if it's worth it or not.
Yeah, you have to kind of make that kind of
judgment call.
Call, yeah.
Yeah, because and again, it differs between smaller and bigger tournaments. So at Nationals, for example, on Brute, I didn't expect to see a whole lot of Wizard players, but I kind of thought, well, I can put 2 equipments in my deck, in my 80 cards, which means I have a great matchup against Wizard if I play it. Or I can leave those out, and across 10 rounds of Swiss, there's probably a decent chance I might play at least 1 Wizard. In a tournament where you can only afford to drop sort of 2 or 3 games, it's really kind of putting your life on the line to just say, I'll take the loss if I play it. And my deck was one that I felt couldn't race Wizard quickly enough. So, and sure enough, I played Wizard first round, so I was kind of patting myself on the back there. And those sort of tooling your deck towards the metagame, it can come across in different ways as well. So in the Arcane Rising metagame, when Dash was just sort of dominating everything as well, I feel a key aspect of how you built your deck then is, do you have enough spaces in your deck to take out all your defense reactions and just have a 60 card really
a streamlined build? Exactly,
because if you were overcompensating for decks like Warrior and Guardian and you had sort of 15 plus defense reactions, plus all your equipments, plus your weapons, then against a deck like Dash, you could find yourself stuck with 6 or 7 cards that are just not good in the matchup.
And yes, same with stuff like Wizard. Like you're versing a Wizard, and then you have all these defense reacts in your deck because you have to play them.
Yeah, exactly. Cards that just that don't do enough in certain matchups to justify their spots and everything. So I feel that's just another consideration to keep in mind when you're building a deck. And so yeah, speaking of deck size as well, again, that's like one side of the coin is you want to be sure you can take out enough cards to have a streamlined deck, but in other situations you want to be able to leave in enough cards so you can sort of go toe-to-toe in a grindy control type strategy. I found that playing sort of Brute versus Warrior, for example, because my strategy involved basically running the opponent out of cards and just blocking the entire game. So I wanted to run as many cards as possible. So when you have cards like I was running like 3 Arc Smash and like sort of 8 equipment / weapons and potions, it cuts down on your flexibility to do that. So I was running things like against Warriors, I think I was leaving in 1 to 2 Arc Smashes purely as block cards.
And I think that's the correct play. Like I've actually thought about doing that as well, just because like 90% of the time it's a block card and 10% you just pitch it.
And just sort of one final thing I suppose as well for sideboarding is I think when you're constructing your deck, you have to be thinking how does it impact your resource distribution as well if you're going to be sideboarding cards out. Because I sort of quite like the idea of when you're building your deck, your blue cards are just sort of multi-dimensional core cards that you can leave in for basically every matchup. Of course, that's not always the case. There might be like 1 or 2 you have to take out. But I think if you can keep that pretty much as consistent as possible, that allows you to use kind of your threats, your yellow and red cards as a toolbox. I think that's why cards like Blue Unmovable, for example, can be very strong, because it's a card as a blue pitch. It's going to be good in most matchups, and in the matchups it's not good in, like most of the time it's just a pitch card anyway. So against Wizard, for example, you can pitch it to block 3 arcane damage. Against Ninja, you might be able to use it against a Plunder on turn or to block a big Surging Strike, things like that. So just making sure that and on the flip side as well, if you've got like a ton of red cards that you're bringing in, that's all well and good. I'm going to bring in my 3 red Unmovable, my 3 red Fate Foreseen and things like that. But then you need to be aware that your distribution you've gone from having sort of an average pitch of 2 to like an average pitch of like 1.7 or 1.8, which is getting a little bit technical with it, but it's like a complicated way of saying you're going to end up with 2 or 3 red cards in your hand too often.
That exact thing actually happened to me where as a Brute player, when I was sideboarding versus a Ninja or Warrior, I did, especially Warrior actually, I found myself, siding in, that was an Arcane Rising meta, siding in all these like red Sing-Belows, red Fate Foreseens, red Unmovables, and then until I actually sat down and wrote down all my sideboarding, that's when I realized like that's why I've been drawing so many red cards versus these decks, because haven't been taking out red cards to replace them for. So I ended up with running like, I don't know, 35 or 40 red cards and just getting too much red in my hand.
Yeah, so and there's like so many different aspects of sideboarding. We could probably be here all day discussing it, but we just wanted to go over some of some of these probably seem obvious when you listen to them, but hopefully, some of these tips are things are helpful that you can apply to your game, because I know there's been a few players on sort of the channel commenting like, how do I sideboard these particular matchups? And yeah, like you can go a little bit deeper with it and have particular game plans. Like you might sideboard one way against someone in the Swiss rounds of a tournament and then sideboard a completely different way in the top 8. Or you can sort of expect that they'll be thinking you go one way, so you go the other. And sometimes you just have a completely different strategy in mind because you've worked it out in testing and it works. Like the best example I can think of is the Brute Mirror in the current meta game. My approach to it was I was thinking, you just leave all those 0 cost reactions in that I just mentioned were so good against Brute, and you've always got that backup to stop them. And when I spoke to Carol about it, he said, "Nah, take them all out. Take all of those out, play 62 guards, and just go 100% aggressive. Try to draw your best hands early."
Yeah.
And that's what I did, and I was lucky enough to win with the 8 of some good Scabskin rolls. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to finish off, I just wanted to mention, for those of you who are interested, I'm going to be uploading a video to our YouTube channel of me opening the Road to Nationals champion envelope with a golden legendary. So yeah, basically, I won't spoil what I opened, but if you're interested to see what it looks like, and interested to see what I've opened, do check it out.
Yep, that's all from us this week. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and as always, we're interested to see your thoughts and comments. Cheers.
Thanks. Session Blood.